Okay, so today we're going to be digging deeper into Indigenous studies. We're going to vet our sources, our book lists, and our book bins in the classroom, our classroom libraries. And I'm hoping that by the end of the session today, you can ask lots of questions that you may have, and you will leave today with a couple ideas for books to put in your classroom. Okay, so this is me. I am a former classroom teacher. I taught kindergarten for 1 year during the COVID pandemic, but other than that, I've taught fourth grade for 8 years. And since then, I moved into the curriculum world, teaching about Indigenous studies and teaching about my Mohegan roots. I went through an 092 certification program. I also continued to get my 6-year degree in social emotional academic learning for social justice leadership. So leading and teaching is my passion. I do miss the students at times, but I love working with adults. So here I am. I also am on the K-12 Curriculum Leadership Steering Committee as Native American leadership. And I see some names within our chat today, some friendly faces that I've worked with in the past or that are actually on that committee with me. So we all do some really great work together. I am the director of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at Mohegan. We create lessons and units of study. We work with schools across the state of Connecticut. So I'd love to connect to your schools if you want PD with your schools as well. This is our vision for today, just setting the space. I'd like it to be a comfortable learning space full of conversation and collaboration. I'm here to work with you, to learn with you, and to guide you. So no question is a silly question, and I'm here to help. We will be discussing oral history and storytelling. Oral history and oral tradition is through word of mouth, and storytelling through books. We will vet some classroom library resources, and I will make suggestions for websites, book lists, blogs. Okay, so a little guideline, keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking, keep your video on if you're comfortable, use the chat to keep the conversation going, and use the raise hand or the emojis if you're feeling excited, okay? So in the chat, I do ask, just so I get some background knowledge, what do you prefer to be called? What is your role in education? And this is right on the slide. Have you learned with Mohegan before? When? And are there other Indigenous nations represented today? I always like to ask that one and make connections with our sister nations. So please just add some notes in the chat. Who are you? Have you learned with me before? Do you have an Indigenous background? Okay, so we have a curriculum and instruction leader. Wonderful. I see someone who's learning with me again, also a curriculum coordinator. Another director of curriculum. So we have a bunch of people in here that are going to benefit from the K-6 conversation. Because today is focused K-6. Grade 1 teacher. Wonderful. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me. Professional learning specialist. All right. And if you haven't worked with me before, welcome. Grade 2 teacher. Okay. Let's keep this going. If people join us late, totally okay. We can be super flexible. I always start my presentations with Katoptom Tamawimu to my Mohegan ancestors. Thank you to all of my ancestors, because without them, I wouldn't have the knowledge that I have today to teach about Mohegan, to teach about Indigenous studies, and everything that has been taught to me has been passed down to me from my elders, and those that are older than me, sometimes even younger than me, teaching me too, but mostly my elders for oral tradition. Okay. So here's a part for us to pause and have some conversation. So I want you to, if you are a curriculum coordinator, if you have a district position, think in a holistic lens. If you are a classroom teacher, I want you to think about your classroom. But let's think about classroom libraries. Okay, think about over the past 10 years, maybe even over the past 20 years. You've been in the classroom for a while. Even if it's the past 5 years, there's been a lot of change. Okay. How have your Native American themed text changed? Have they changed at all? Are there still dusty books on your shelves? Okay. And then I have a statistic here, and it's from the Indigenous Future Survey. If you've worked with me before, you may have seen this statistic. It came from a Native-led research of Native peoples. And the statistic is, people often express disappointment or anger that what they were taught in school was so sparse or misleading. So that's a big idea to think about, right? So using that big idea, think about your classroom library and who can share something with me. Pick 1, 2, or 3. 3 is, how can this statistic connect directly to classroom libraries? Okay, because today we're talking about resources, we're talking about books, we're talking about putting books in the hands of students. So you could raise your hand to share out loud, you could write in the chat, the conversation, the collaboration, that's going to keep our presentation engaging, right? So please share.
I could go ahead. I am a
Yes, go
first
ahead,
grade
Laura.
teacher, but I work amongst all our grade levels K to 4 with resources that connect with social studies and content area. And I think, especially over the last 10 years, I think texts have changed tremendously in a more positive way. I think we went from having 10 years, even 5 years ago, 6 years ago, even, the past 3 years. I think there's been a huge shift. And I think noticing it's gone from a lot of books written by, in particular, those who identify as white male authors. And it's very monolithic. It's very much, a lot of the texts are based on that Indigenous people lived in teepees and the pilgrims came and we have Thanksgiving, and all those themes were just a through line. And now we're noticing texts that are by Native authors, illustrators, and I think it's really amazing that we're seeing it. There's not only elementary level text, but there's also text for middle age readers and middle school. And I think more illustrators and authors are collaborating, and the books are just amazing in terms of talking about their individual cultures and nations, but also connecting with family themes and themes that kids can relate to. So I think that's amazing. I think it is still something where, not to go into number 2 also too much, but I think there's still a lot to do with finding those books. There are lots of texts like "We Are Water Protectors" and anything illustrated by Michaela Goad. There's lots of authors that are becoming more relevant and more in the mainstream, but it's still something where you have to really seek, and there are a lot of individual publishing and independent publishing companies that are great, but it's been something that's going in a good direction, I think, from the perspective of an elementary teacher.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. You had so many topics that you discussed that we will be discussing today. And we will be hitting on the majority of those. I really want us to look at those native written, native illustrated books to bring into our classrooms, right? Getting rid of those dusty books that have misconceptions, that are not great to put in the hands of our kids, right? So we have some work to do today. I have really good recommendations for you guys. And you're right, there are so many books out there. So where to get started? I also see in the chat, some libraries are underfunded and don't have a full-time library media specialist. So they don't have updated books. And I do understand that as a classroom teacher, as a 4th grade teacher, I didn't have a library media specialist helping me with my classroom library, and I had to do a lot of research on my own, right? I had to do a lot of vetting. I was on Scholastic all the time, looking at those book reviews, but we're going way beyond that because a lot of the texts that I'm recommending now aren't even on those Scholastic websites, okay? A lot of great recommendations. So yes, it depends on the school and the district. We've been trying to update our books. Awesome. Few dusty ones left. And sometimes those dusty ones may just have to go, even if you only have a few books. We want good, solid resources. So we're going to work on that today. Can anybody speak to feeling in school like what you were taught was sparse or misleading? Can anybody connect to that? And I'm hoping that the more we teach about Indigenous studies, the younger we teach, the less we have to talk about this topic, right? I see some head shaking.
I'll speak to that for a minute,
Yes, Angela,
Sam.
please.
So I think it's very true, and I think sometimes our teachers want to do better, but I feel that sometimes they're not confident in their own understanding. So even though that's very true for them, I think sometimes they're unsure because they don't have the content knowledge and they're not confident in that knowledge to be the ones to then share that knowledge with their kids. So I definitely think that there's an awareness there and that people want to do better. And I think we have lots of people that are trying to really, get there by gaining that knowledge, so they're more confident when they're sharing the information with their students.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. Finding that confidence, the more we learn, the more we collaborate, the more we work together, the more confident we'll become. We've updated books our students are exposed to, things written this century by Native authors, Native illustrators. And I truly believe that if you're teaching about a type of peoples in the classroom, the story should be told out of the mouths of those peoples. So if you're teaching about a specific culture, you should be bringing that culture into your classroom, whether it's in person, whether it's through a story, whether it's through a book. Okay. And we're 15 minutes in, so I want to get us going into this work, but really great conversations to get us started. I still see more in the chat, and I'll revisit that when we have some turn and talk moments. Thank you for all of your sharing. Next steps to indigenize your classroom. There are a lot of articles out there talking about decolonizing the classroom, right? I want to give positivity to that. So I want us to indigenize our classroom. We have some work to do. Some of us are already doing some of this work. Can always connect with the Indigenous roots of your community. Ask questions. Who lived here before you? Who lives here now? What happened? Vetting your resources. Bring current events, issues, contemporary Native life into your classroom. You can do that through celebrations, challenges even, music and art. But we also have to have conversations of cultural appreciation, so we're not appropriating a culture. Okay. And we want to practice our verb tense. Native people are still here today. So some of the books that you may see on your shelves, some of those dusty ones, may paint Native peoples in the past. And while we could have stories about groups of peoples that were in a certain place in the past, many of those groups of peoples are still in the present. So we just want to be comfortable with that verb tense. Not Native people used to, but Native people are. Okay, so let's chat again. Do you feel comfortable with any of these already? Or what would you like more practice on? Those you could type in the chat or you could talk. And I think the more I work with teachers, the more they work with me. And I do have some friends and colleagues in here who have been working with me for quite a while. I do see the confidence and I do see you're more comfortable with these topics the more you practice. So I appreciate the work you're doing.
I'll share.
Yes,
I think we in our district, we've done a lot of work on this, especially recently, and integrating a lot of our language arts and social studies units to provide additional perspectives and texts. And our students are learning so much more about the Native experience now, like truly, than they ever did. The challenge I think I'm feeling is finding the resources, the best books and websites and media that are content appropriate for third and fourth graders to read, like in terms of a reading level,
Yep.
Because that's really, I think, what most of our challenge is right now in doing it more than we are.
Very good. Thank you. Within my fourth grade classroom, obviously, I saw many levels. I taught in an urban school setting. And a lot of our texts were used as mentor texts, but I also found texts that could be used in book clubs. So there are some choices out there. And the more you read the books yourselves and become comfortable with those books, the more you can build those resources. Because I also wouldn't just want to give you a list and have you purchase that list without you becoming comfortable with the content too. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so what I need, what our tribal nations need, are allies in the classroom. Okay, so it is important to educate yourself and share resources. It's important to change the way you talk about Native communities. Seek out those Native stories. You're here today doing that. Okay, you are our allies. And make that representation a priority while you're teaching it. Because the Native students in your classroom, they see it, they feel it. The non-Native students in your classroom, they see it, they feel it. And we need to appreciate our diversity. So what is our comfort level to take these next steps? Think to yourself. Okay, think of a 1 through 3 scale. 1 being I'm not so comfortable, 3 being I'm super comfortable. Just do a little check-in with yourself. Hoping by the end of today, you'll gain a little more confidence. And I thank you for being our allies. Okay, so I told you that we were going to talk about oral tradition and storytelling because there are various lenses in Indigenous communities when it comes to stories. We have oral tradition and we have oral history. And that word oral means that it's spoken in person, it's spoken out loud, and it may not be written down. We have a lot of stories that remain a tradition. And that can't be written down per our council of elders or per the elders in our community. But we're becoming a little more tech savvy within Mohegan in general. We have an Educators Project website, and we are creating content for educators. So you're starting to see a little more out there that you can bring into your classroom. But I do want you to understand too that not everything can be shared in a culture. Okay, and really just understanding that you may not be able to get your hands on everything because some of our teachings are sacred, some of our teachings are private, but we are willing to share a lot of it. Right, and that's what I want you to take away today. So storytelling remains a tradition in tribal communities today. Okay, it's still going on today, oral history. And we preserve our past through this, through a never-ending story circle. So I want you to think of it in a circle. You see on the screen, there is a circle with 4 directions in it: north, east, south, and west. And there are 4 parts to a story circle, those 4 sacred directions in Native communities. And when we're learning about oral history or stories, and sometimes those stories are written in books, we're always going to think in those 4 parts. Stories often have central themes. Just like in the classroom, you have themes, you have morals, you have lessons. And some of those common themes are read on the screen for you. I'll just say a couple. But our creation story, where we came from, our relationship to nature, to Mother Earth, how we're all interconnected, life lessons, honoring our ancestors. We are always honoring our ancestors, the roots of our family, and we're always planning for our future, the generations of the future. And I have a good practice here for you, a tip. So if you're ever told a Native story, it is good practice when you're telling that story, because once that story was shared with you, you have permission to share that story. You just have to remember to discuss where that story came from. Because if you got it from a tribal community, we want that story to live on. So for example, if you teach a story that I teach you today, you're going to teach your students, I learned this from the Mohegan Tribe, and this is what they taught me. This is what I'm going to teach you. And by sharing that culture with that story, or talking about the Native author in a book, or talking about the Native community that's being taught in a book, you're continuing that knowledge and you're practicing that tribal communities are still here today with your students. So that's a good practice tip to help with cultural appreciation, to continue your verb tense practice. Okay. And thank you to those in the chat. I see you responding to what I'm saying. Okay, so these are the 4 steps to the story circle. And I'm sure some of you are already doing these things, but if you want to teach storytelling through an Indigenous perspective in the classroom, you want to make sure you follow these 4 steps. And step 1 is listening. When a story is being told to you, or when a Native book is being read to you, pay attention to the story. We have 2 ears to hear both sides. Step 2, observe. We have 2 eyes to see what is clear and what is hidden in the story. So if so far you've listened and you've observed, just like what I'm telling you right now, I see active listening in front of me. That 3rd step is so important to remember. You have to commit the story to memory, especially if it's shared to you orally, because you don't have it written down to look back at, right? You have to listen, observe, and remember. And if we don't remember, it's as if we didn't know it in the first place. And that's a Mohegan teaching. And then step 4, to complete that story circle, you have to share. The only way to truly remember a story or to pass it on is to share that story. It goes to a new listener. You follow those 4 steps again. Okay, so those are the 4 steps of the story circle to get all the way around that circle to learn a lesson. So a question to think about as we continue today. How can the parts of a story circle fit into your classroom practices? Could you see this fitting in at certain parts of the day, in certain grade levels, in certain content? Let's do some brainstorming. Where could these fit? And then, of course, I'll give my suggestions.
I think if any, especially in the elementary level, if you do like restorative practices and you do like a sharing circle or you do like a morning meeting, I think this is a really great way to incorporate literacy and really have the kids go through the entire 4 parts of you listening, or actually you going through the 4 parts of a story. And then also thinking about revisiting it later on during the day, I think is something, and to continue back to it and have them even work on retelling the story would be a good thing to do with an literacy connection too.
Definitely, which promotes comprehension. It helps with engagement. I see in the chat also morning meeting, end of day circles also. So it fits very nicely in literacy. It could also fit in readers, writers workshop. So even in writing, if you're integrating content too, hopefully maybe you're teaching social studies or science within other content. These 4 parts, if you're continuously teaching with them, it helps promote that engagement. And it gives that Indigenous lens. So kiddos aren't just sitting and listening to a story, but they're actively listening to that story. So listen, observe, remember, and share. Okay, so let's dig into vetting. First, we're going to start with some non-example books. And these are a few that I like to talk about because it helps me relate to you also. When I was in the classroom, I had to find some non-example books that I had in my classroom and I started teaching with, and I'm like, nope, I cannot teach with these anymore, right? And then I've also seen lists of, I do not recommend teaching with these books, right? So we have those 2 different lenses, your own personal perceptions of, I can't use this book again, or books that you're being told, please don't use this book. So Debbie Reese, I saw somebody talk about her in the chat. and I follow her wholeheartedly. She has a blog and she has book lists, recommendations, she has non-recommendations, and I'm going to share all of that with you today. But she stated, stereotypical, biased, or inappropriate content can harm Native children and can misinform all children. So we have to be so careful with what we give our students so that we don't feed into those stereotypes. We don't give them that biased information. We want to inform, not misinform. Okay, so here's a very full slide. We're going to start with the book Encounter. This is a book that I taught with for many years. It was suggested within my curriculum that I taught with. And there were some good parts to this book, but there's some not good parts also. Jane Yolen, a beautiful author. If you've read this book before, she is not Native, but she did do research through some Native people and researchers. But she had a book trailer that was made. And in that book trailer, which, you know, we love to engage our readers and our learners, and we're like, let's get you hooked on this book. I watched it with my students, and on the screen, it said, today the Taino are gone. And the Taino are not gone. They are a thriving society. I gave you a link if you teach about them in the classroom. So what I did like about the book was it was taught through a Taino boy, through his perspective. So students could walk through the shoes of somebody their own age, right? Really great. And there are learning opportunities if we see these misconceptions, if we can teach through the content. But to be honest, there are better options. So I stopped teaching with this book altogether. And this is just one of those books that I say, I do not recommend this book because of my experience, and this is why. I'm sure you have some books that you've had those feelings about before also. On the right of the screen, I went into Debbie Reese's blog, and she has a section called Not Recommended. And right now, as of today, she has 380 books that are not recommended to teach with. And here's just a couple. Those old school dusty books that are probably on your shelf, but that 1993 book was redone again in 2019. Like, look at that year, 2019. So within 5 years, we have a book full of stereotypes and misrepresentations. And you can see on the bottom, it's an image of Native peoples and what we would call pilgrims sharing food. The Native people have regalia on, which if we teach about regalia in the classroom, that is spiritual, that is sacred. It's only worn during ceremony. And then we have one of the boys who is thinking about this, dressing in a headdress that he made at home with a comb, right? So not appropriate, though I can relate to this. In second grade, we sat in a hallway and we had this meal, and some of us dressed like Native Americans and some of us dressed like pilgrims, right? But it is cultural appropriation. So I don't want my children doing this in the classroom, and I don't want students reading about this in books because it's not appropriate. It's misinformation, right? So these are non-examples. AICL, American Indians and Children's Literature, that is Debbie Reese's blog, where she has so many resources. She's very active on there. So you'll leave with that link. Okay. So let's pause and reflect for a second. Think about those classroom libraries. Do you have concerns? Is there anything you want to change? What do you need? I've heard some things already. We just need to know where to start. We've been updating. There are just so many options out there. I've also read too that budgets are a challenge, and if you don't have a library media specialist, maybe that's something that you need help with, right? So what I want you to do is make use of resources like coming to PDs like this, right? You're here. Make use of the blogs. Make use of book lists that are compiled by Native peoples. Okay. Not everybody thinks the same. Not everybody has the same opinion, but it gives you a great start. So I have AICL, There is a picture book link on this slide, young adult book link. And I learned within this past year, I was working with a teacher, and Get Epic, which is Epic now. A lot of these books that I recommend are on there. So if you create an Epic account and you save some of the books, you can play them on your smartboard. You can play them digitally and not have to buy copies for your classroom also. So we have technology. Try to get those resources in different ways. So our goal is to select books and other materials that feature accurate, tribe-specific representations of Native people, both past and present. Also, I should have noted this earlier. I see people taking notes. You're going to have this whole slideshow when we're done. You're going to get all of these resources. So no stress on writing everything down unless I say something that you don't see. Okay. So accurate, tribe-specific. But how do you know that? Sometimes you have to rely on other people to help you through the blogs, through the book list. And I'm here today. Okay, here's another suggestion. Me as a grade level partner team, or with a buddy, or maybe even on your own, but hopefully you have someone to do this with, grab a cup of coffee, have some fun. Here's a worksheet. It is from the Native Knowledge 360 website, National Museum of the American Indian. And you use this like a rubric to vet a book in your classroom. And a little cheat sheet on the left. So some of the questions that you're surveying as you look at a book: who is it written by? Who is it illustrated by? Are they Native? Are they of a Native nation? Are they talking about their own nation? They probably have the most knowledge in their community, and that is a great resource. Is the book historically accurate? If you're reading about the author in the beginning, they will probably tell you where the information came from, how they researched it. Are they Native? Is it their tribe? Did they research from that tribe? Are the characters and content tribe specific? Does the book avoid stereotypes and generalizations? So if I'm teaching about a tribe in the Midwest and the people in this book are dressed in regalia from northeastern woodlands, we have a problem, right? We should not be generalizing, just like the wigwam versus the teepee. What Native peoples used to live in today, there should not be generalizations because not all tribes are the same. Is there a note or glossary in the book? Because if the author is using language, their native language, they should be explaining that to you. They should be showing you, these are the meanings of these words. This is what these words mean, maybe the pronunciations. And is contemporary life included? Think about that verb tense, right? Okay, and this is a good one. Suggestions to teach around the Thanksgiving holiday in the classroom. I have 2 books here for you. The first one is If You Lived During the Plymouth Thanksgiving. Hopefully you've heard about this book. It is new within the past couple of years. It was written by Chris Newell. And I also added a podcast link on here for you with Chris Newell. And he talks about his experiences in researching with the Wampanoag people and writing and creating, and his thoughts on Thanksgiving, on the American Thanksgiving, compared to his upbringing in a Native community. Okay, may not be a podcast that you would use in your classroom, but I think it's great for educator knowledge. And these are 2 quotes from that podcast. So Chris Newell said, "The holiday we celebrate today does not have any real connection to the Mayflower's landing. In fact, the story that links them was not created until 200 years later." So if you have misconceptions, this book really helps in the classroom. It's a little higher level. I would suggest it for grades 3 to 6. I would totally suggest it for all educators to read. Chris also said that the story of the Mayflower landing is different depending on whether the storyteller viewed the events from the boat or from the shore. So when you're reading a text, having that understanding of who wrote this, whose perspective is it written through. And then the other book I have here for you is Kapinamak. And it was written about the Wampanoag Thanksgiving story. I would suggest that for grades 2 to 4. But my suggestions too, even if you're a 6th grade teacher and you want another text full of Native content and full of really great illustrations, use the storybooks. Kiddos love storybooks and they love the content. Okay. So thoughts on these resources so far? And I see some stuff in the chat, so I'm just going to read that quick. I see a thumbs up. Thank you. Okay, so I see that schools are adopting reading programs. And of course, within those reading programs, you may have mentor texts. You may have suggested texts, right? And Tommy DePola, well, I adored him when I was in student teaching a bajillion years ago. There's much better content out there. Yes, written by Indigenous authors. Both of these books are written and illustrated by Indigenous authors, and they were both working with the Wampanoag people. There is a Native person who is Mashpee Wampanoag that wrote Kapinamak. So the story that affected their people first, we want those books. Okay, let's keep going. So I'm going to go through different grade level recommendations. I'm also going to give suggested topics. And I give these suggested topics for 2 reasons. One, I've been working with the Connecticut State Department of Ed on what the standards are that we're teaching within the classroom. But I also have an understanding of what content is appropriate for grade levels. So different topics to teach K to 2. Animals, being thankful, seasons, moons. There are 13 moons in the Mohegan Tribe. There are 13 moons on a turtle's back. Okay, 13 is a really important number. The importance of land and water. Native identity, celebration, happiness, roots of your community. So many topics could be taught to bring Indigenous peoples into your classroom. The first 3 books on here can be purchased as board books. Those are much lower level. But if we're talking about reading levels too, you may want those for your 1st and 2nd grade classroom. And then we have 2 more. Water protectors was brought up once. And I also have rock your mocks. So talking about Native identity and talking about moccasins in the classroom, bringing discussion over cultural items, cultural clothing. It's a way to appreciate, to celebrate, and bring awareness. Okay, so those are some of my recommendations. 3 to 4. Now you're going to see I have many more recommendations, and that's because there are more standards and more content in grades 3 and 4 to teach Native American peoples. Oh, I love that. Talking about water protectors with language, metaphors, symbolism. It is a very rich book and the illustrations are incredible. There are so many Indigenous components within them. So in grades 3 to 4, you may see some of the themes repeated, but they should be repeated. So being thankful, family, bringing in Native arts such as basketry and dance. So I have a book on this list called Kunu's Basket, and that was written by a tribe in Maine. And it talks about the practice of basketry, why it's important, how baskets are made. And these practices are not going to be the same for every tribe, but it brings a book component into your classroom. Dance. So jingle dress dancers, we have jingle dancing. There's also a book about powwows. So there's two, Powwow Day and Bow Wow Powwow, and it explains what a powwow is. And if you live within this area, which I assume the majority of us teach in Connecticut, there are multiple powwows that are open to the community that you can go to during the summer months. We have a Wigwam Festival in August, the week of August 14th, I believe. And you can come, you can celebrate with us, and you can see dance and regalia and buy art and eat food. And it's just teaching students what powwows are and building awareness. Let's see, importance of the past and the present, of resources, that Native identity again. I do on the top left, we have that Kapinamuk, but we also have a nonfiction book about Indigenous Peoples Day, because you'll have those conversations, especially in 4th grade. There are also books in the She Persisted category with 3 different inspirational tribal women. They are lower level chapter books. Okay. And then you'll also be teaching about roots of a community. You're going to start talking about tribal sovereignty. What does that mean to be a sovereign nation? And like I said, Indigenous Peoples Day. So you see the first blades of sweetgrass on there. It talks about sweetgrass. It talks about those herbal practices and cultural ways that students may not have awareness of, but you can bring those books into the classroom and have those conversations. Okay. And then for 5th and 6th grade, on the top, there is a book. It's called Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. And I put the for young people on there. This is a great book to buy for yourself too. It teaches you about US history and where Indigenous people were involved, okay, where their story was, because a lot of us learned US history and didn't learn about the Native American peoples throughout it. And this book brings a lot of that awareness. It also brings questions that you can bring into the classroom, topics you can bring into the classroom. Ancestor Approved is a book full of intertribal stories from many different tribes. It was a collaboration to bring a lot of their oral histories into the classroom for educators. So again, we have, for topics, some similarities, but then we really elevate you're definitely going to be teaching about tribal sovereignty, cultural norms and beliefs about governance, government systems within tribal nations, land rights, land treaties. And some of the books that I have on here are higher level chapter books. Colonization and the Wampanoag Story was written through the help of the Wampanoag also. I would suggest reading that. And then we have historical fiction stories. So talking about baseball, rock and roll, getting kiddos engaged into real life stories of people. Sharice's Big Voice, so activism. We are still here. All really great suggestions. But of course, I suggest reviewing them first yourself, becoming comfortable with the content. Where does it fit within your classroom or curriculum? And then purchasing from there, if you find it appropriate. Okay. Ways to participate and connect further with Mohegan. If you are ever in my area, which is Uncasville, I would be so happy to gift you a copy of Makiawisug. It is the gift of the little people, and it is the only published Mohegan book, picture book that we have out there right now. And I have many copies that I would love to share. So if you want to reach out to me via email, I would be happy to share that book with you. It is available digitally on the Educators Project if you want to show it in your classroom. There was also a claymation made about this oral history, about this oral story. And that claymation is on the Educators Project too. So if you haven't before, we have a Tanaquidgeon Museum. It's free admission. please come and join us to learn more. We have educational outreach programs where if you reach out to us, we will teach for free at your school. It's a 1-hour outreach where we have outreach specialists dress in their regalia, teach about their regalia, dance, drum, and talk about our cultural ways. We have the Educators Project, and the login information is right here for you to access lessons and units of study that have been created, and it's forever growing. Join us in August at our Wigwam Festival. And you can also reach out to me if you would like professional development at your school. My team or myself, we can work with your teachers for 2 to 3 hours to talk about Indigenous studies into curriculum, Indigenous identity, misconceptions, go way deeper into land, maps, tribal sovereignty, Mohegan ways. And Katop Tom Tamawimu. Thank you to everybody. This is my contact information. If you would like to email me, but you'll be receiving this presentation from me soon.